things with filters is that you can filter out stuff that fits a specific design. And on the lay of the land, it's so incredible that even when there are tough corners such as gravel or rocks that are giant, and you have a nice padding of snow on top of it, it can be incredibly soothing. So that you can utilize is that friction and things that are solid follow the path of least resistance when jumbled around randomly, and that heat rises. So these are two ways of gauging and scaling when everything is of looking like a two mirror lens or a marble melting and looking more like marble as a liquid. One way to imitate this is of what Molotov cocktails would engage in deactivating and activating what a sense is. In all totality, this is what glow sticks are done as. When you break the stick inside and then shake it around, it computes an entirely different form. This is something I saw in Boise, Idaho at the Science Museum. If you go up against a wall that looks like the glow stick and a flash went off, the mirror image of your shadow was stuck onto the wall for a significant period of time. Kind of like how an Etch-a-Sketch traces. That tracing is done by a shadow instead of a point on an Etch-a-Sketch back end. The same illusionary effect is done with coding within the cellular activity, but instead of it occurring on the backdrop, the calculation is done within its center core. So why am I talking about like a giant egg across the entire Earth's surface, and in the egg cracking, what that might mean to you becoming enslaved by an undead army is quite the fact that a cell wall has pertaining to what would seem as infinity, and if cells are able to fire off what is infinity, meaning the ability for them to not get overridden, is just in the case of them being able to have the freedom of mobility or assembly, if you're referring to U.S. judiciary. But what kind of a thing would be a stopping power for that, a prohibiting sense? If you got overridden by a sloppy copy, getting overridden by a sloppy copy in cell life would be if it were infiltrated, and in order to get blindsided, you've got to trick the thing that keeps cells prevalent, the white blood cells. And why that's a causal effect nowadays, you have to look at modern technology. Within cars, more and more are coming to terms and overriding with an electric sense circuitry inside vehicles, like keys, for instance, needing transmitters. But the more that you can focus a gear shifting within a electric output, you can utilize that as being more of an advantage if you can focus on shifting at the right time and the circuits allow for it to have a perfect gear shift. The toss-up of automatic or manual is you in the middle, utilizing as much as an AI smartness could within the pumping of the shift. This is a fate of what a computer would try and do when it tries to be more and more of a physical as opposed to a binary. What this in turn has to get through is a biological And what more is a crappy screensaver than a thing that's spread over the land that is uncontrollable? At its center core has a gene of coding. This is how a computer can act as though it is part of a physical embodiment, just as a car tries to act like a computer. The interplay between the two is seen to the extremes of how much one can seem like the other. Example, from this far away, you can't see that there's tiny little beads of snow on top of it until you look closer. Like with the filter, it's like a magnifying glass looking closer. Where now you start to see a difference of, there might be little tiny dandruff drops on top of the snow, but in more so. So things that are so big that it would be prominent longer than how long the dinosaurs reigned. We don't know how long they were alive for, but this would be something more extravagant than them. If you have an entire world functioning off of what has gone missing, and then who has something that they shouldn't, it's going to be just as bad as whatever the worst thing that a dinosaur did. Probably what Genghis Khan was emulating. And inside of making your life a living hell, if you're not inside of the belly, it's darker. You can see, by golly, there are white drops on top of them. And then undoing the blanked outside, you can do that with a polarization, kind of like how two-tone cars are. You can see like this marbling effect be utilized to see through the first layer, where on a pearl it is just like a diamond that twinkles, but you see the twinkle on a more pronounced round shape about the pearl, as opposed to just certain spots where lines are cut to cross on diamonds. That pronounced area is what you can play with in polarization screens. And why is it important to understand how the two endpoints of a one-dimensional plane could be illusionary? Well, it would be as though marble would be as though it were fluid-like, and then the fluidity of a two-mirror plane, the plane of an entire mirror you can't see out the other end, would be so reflective that it would give the illusion of the marble plane looking as though it were not solidified but still being mixed about. And it's at that point of which where you would see someone saying at the end of a 1D plane, go back to the other end, because the setting of the marble is unfixed. And then once you got to the other end, they would say, look at the double mirror plane. It's not yet sought through. And so when you're doubling back the second time, you look back at the double mirror plane, the mirrorless plane, and then you see that not only were they right about the marble not being fixed, because that was still being strewn about inside of the mirror plane, but then not being able to see through the mirror, you would be caught in two illusions. So that would equal like a third plane at the midpoint. If I know anything, it's 2D. It can be looked at as 1D from either end, especially if you're at the endpoints of a 1D plane. It would be as though a detonator before a detonator went off. I want to explain how the early days phosphate worked as Molotov cocktails. They put in a piece of rubber inside of a bottle